Something happens when you stop being there. Not gradually, not in the slow fade of someone who is pulling back incrementally while still technically present, but genuinely, when the specific, reliable, always available quality of your presence in the dynamic is suddenly, completely, honestly not there anymore. Something happens that the avoidant was not prepared for. That their model of you, their model of the dynamic, their model of themselves within the dynamic did not account for. That their self-sufficiency narrative, the one that said the connection was something they could manage without, something they could create distance from and return to on their own terms, something whose value was real but not irreplaceable, did not survive contact with the actual experience of your actual absence. The model was wrong, not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, built on a foundational misassessment of what you were actually providing, what your presence was actually worth, what the daily, consistent, unannounced, entirely unacknowledged contribution of your availability was doing to the quality of their interior life. They did not know your value while you were there. This is one of the more painful truths available in the entire landscape of avoidant psychology. Not because it is cruel, but because it is so specifically human, so entirely predictable given everything the psychology produces, and so devastatingly consequential for you who were there and were valuable, and were not adequately seen in the value until the value was no longer present to be taken for granted. Your absence changed that. Your absence, in the specific way that only genuine absence can, exposed what your presence was worth in the only language that actually reaches the defended interior of someone who has been managing the significance of the connection from behind the safety of your consistent availability. The language of loss, of the specific, targeted, cannot be reasoned away absence of something that was always there and is now simply not. This conversation is about what that absence exposed, about what it revealed about your value that the dynamic itself was always preventing from being adequately acknowledged, about what is happening on the other side of your absence that you may not have visibility into and that you deserve to understand, not to go back, to know what you are worth, which is something you have deserved to know clearly for longer than the dynamic has been allowing. The foundation requires honesty before anything else. Because the conversation about your absence exposing your value to an avoidant runs the risk of being heard as a validation of the waiting, as the suggestion that the exposure of your value is a reason to return to the dynamic that undervalued you, or a reason to hold on in the hope that the exposure will produce the adequate valuing that was previously absent. It is not either of those things. Your value is not contingent on being recognized by the avoidant. It was not created by their recognition, and it is not diminished by its absence, and it is not restored by the exposure of it that your absence produces. Your value is the simple, non-negotiable, entirely independent of anyone's acknowledgement, fact of who you are, and what you bring and what the specific quality of your presence contributes to the lives and spaces and relationships you occupy. The avoidant's eventual recognition of it, which is real, which is happening, which is the subject of this entire conversation, is their arrival at an accurate assessment of something that was always true, not the creation of something new, the belated recognition of something that existed the whole time they were undervaluing it. This distinction matters, because the valuing because absence is not the same as the valuing because you are genuinely seen. The avoidant who values you because you are gone, because the loss activated the recognition, because the departure of the taken for granted exposed the significance of the taken for granted, that avoidant is accurate in their assessment but late to it. And late, in this context, means something. It means the value was present and not recognized when the recognition was available and when you needed it, and when the dynamic was running the cost of its absence on your account, daily. That lateness is not a small thing. It is the entire shape of what the dynamic cost you. The chronic, accumulated, specific experience of being valuable and not being treated as valuable. Of contributing something real and not having the contribution acknowledged. Of loving someone whose patterns prevented the love from being adequately met, day after day, in the ordinary moments when meeting it would not have required anything extraordinary. Only the simple, chosen, daily decision to show up for someone who was showing up for you. Hold that history. Do not let the exposure of your value, however satisfying to finally witness, revise the history that produced the need for the exposure in the first place. What is actually happening in the avoidant when your absence makes your value undeniable needs to be walked through with the precision it deserves. Because the sequence matters, and each stage illuminates something important about both the avoidant psychology and the specific mechanism by which your absence does what your presence could not. The first stage begins before the absence is fully real to the avoidant. In the period when the absence is present as a fact, but the avoidance model is still generating the prediction of its temporariness. This is the stage of background processing. The absence is filed as information, but not yet as significant information. The model says this is a phase, a pause, a temporary configuration that will return to the previous configuration in the ordinary course of things. The avoidant continues their life with the low-level, background automatic scanning for the signal that the temporary nature of the absence is about to become visible, for the reaching that the model says should be coming. This stage can last a variable amount of time depending on the specific history of the dynamic and how many times the previous configuration has been restored after periods of similar absence. If the history includes multiple instances of you withdrawing and then returning, the model has stronger grounds for predicting the return, and the background processing continues longer without escalating. If the history is shorter or less repetitive, the model's confidence is lower and the escalation to the next stage occurs faster. But the escalation always occurs eventually. Because the absence, if it is genuine, if it has the specific unperformable quality of real withdrawal rather than the held breath quality of strategic distance, does not produce the signal the model is waiting for. The return does not come on the predicted timeline. The silence extends past the range the model accounts for, and the background processing, finding no confirming signal, can no longer remain background. The second stage is where the absence begins to register at the level of actual experience rather than predicted experience, where the avoidant stops anticipating the return and starts experiencing the absence. And the experience of the absence, the direct, immediate, no longer buffered by prediction experience of the actual quality of life without your presence in it, is where the exposure of your value begins. It does not begin with a dramatic recognition of loss. It begins with something quieter and in some ways more revelatory. It begins with the avoidant noticing the specific ways their daily experience is different. Not abstractly different. Specifically, pointedly, in the targeted ways that your presence was contributing to the quality of their experience, without being recognized as the source of those contributions. There was something in the texture of the days when you were available that is not in the texture of the days when you are not. Something specific to you and your presence, and the particular way your engagement with them affected their interior experience. It was not always dramatic, not always the charged, intense, peak moment quality of the best times between you. Often it was quieter than that, the specific quality of being understood without having to fully explain. The particular ease of a dynamic in which someone was genuinely attuned to you without the attunement requiring your performance of legibility. The background sense of being cared about, not demonstratively, not in ways that pressed against the fear of closeness, but in the quiet, consistent, entirely present way of someone whose caring was simply there. That quality is not in the days now, and its absence is not immediately dramatic, but it is immediately present. A slight flattening, a particular quality of aloneness that is different from the ordinary comfortable solitude the avoidant is practiced at inhabiting. A reaching of the internal attention towards something it has become accustomed to finding available and finding instead the specific pointed texture of its absence. The third stage is where the absence begins to generate the retroactive accounting, the review of the history of the dynamic through the specific lens of what is now missing. The avoidance mind, which has been processing the dynamic all along, but from the position of someone whose model assumed your continued availability, now processes it from the position of someone whose model has been revised by actual experience of actual absence. And the retrospective processing from this new position reveals things that the previous processing consistently missed or minimized or contextualized into something less significant than they actually were. The specific moments of your generosity, the specific ways your availability was offered without announcement and without the requirement of reciprocity, the particular qualities of your attention and your care, and your consistent, undemanding, entirely genuine presence in the relationship. All of this, previously processed through the lens of a model that had your availability as a given, was assessed at the value that taken for granted things are always assessed, which is to say, substantially underassessed, substantially less than their actual worth, substantially less than what the experience of their absence is now demonstrating them to have been. The retroactive accounting is not comfortable. It has the specific quality of a recognition arriving too late, of seeing clearly something that was visible the whole time but was not being looked at directly. Of understanding, in the undeniable language of actual loss, what the consistent undervaluing of your presence was actually failing to honor, and the understanding, arriving this way, carries with it a weight that the intellectually acknowledged but not fully felt version of it never carried. It lands, in a specific bodily nervous system level way that important truths land when they arrive through experience rather than through information. The fourth stage is where the retroactive accounting produces something more than recognition, where the recognition begins to generate the specific internal experience that your absence, real, sustained, genuinely not returning, is designed to produce in a person who is finally honestly encountering the full value of what they had. It produces regret, not the mild, passing, this could have gone differently regret of someone who has lost something replaceable. The specific, heavier, more personally confronting regret of someone who is reviewing the history and seeing, with uncomfortable clarity, the specific, repeated, entirely avoidable moments when the dynamic called for something different from what they gave. When the showing up was available and the withdrawal was chosen. When the repair was possible and the managing was chosen instead. When your need was visible and the comfortable distance was chosen over the uncomfortable presence. When the specific, available, not particularly costly choice of acknowledging your value was made in favor of the easier, less vulnerable, less honest choice of taking it for granted. The regret is not vague, it is targeted, it has specific addresses, specific moments in the history of the dynamic that are now, in the light of the absence, entirely legible as moments in which something real was available and was not adequately honored. The avoidant's private, defended, rarely accessed capacity for honest self-confrontation encounters these moments and finds in them the plain evidence of a specific and consequential pattern of undervaluing. This regret is one of the most psychologically significant experiences the avoidant's interior world produces in the aftermath of genuine loss. Not because it is comfortable, because it is honest, because it is one of the few available experiences in the avoidant's interior that cannot be managed through the usual strategies, cannot be reframed or contextualized or routed into something more comfortable without losing its honest quality. The regret is the honest accounting. And the avoidant who allows it to be what it is, who does not immediately reach for the management strategy that would soften it into something less confronting, is the avoidant who is being changed by the absence in the specific way that genuine change requires. Your value, as exposed by your absence, is not a single thing. It is composite. And naming the specific components of it, the specific ways your presence was contributing to the quality of the dynamic and of the avoidant's interior experience, is important because the components are not always the ones that seem most obvious. The most obvious component is the love. The specific, genuine, generously offered love that you brought to the relationship. And yes, its absence is felt. But the love is not the only component, and in some ways it is not even the most immediately felt component in the early stages of the exposure. The components that tend to register first are the quieter ones. The ones that were so consistently present that they functioned as background rather than foreground, as infrastructure rather than event. The first component is the quality of your attention. The specific, attuned, genuinely interested quality of the attention you brought to the avoidant, to their thoughts and their feelings, and the particular texture of their interior life that most people never had the patience or the perception to adequately receive. Most people in the avoidant's life have engaged with the presenting surface, the competent, composed, managed distance version that is most commonly available. You engaged with something closer to the actual person, with the specific, real, not fully public self that the avoidant rarely makes available, but that your particular quality of attention created the conditions for. And the absence of that quality of attention, the return to a world in which the engagement is primarily with the surface rather than with the actual person, is a specific, targeted loss that the avoidant feels in the particular way of something that is noticed by contrast. The second component is the specific quality of ease that your presence created, not the ease of low stakes or casual investment, the ease of genuine understanding, of not having to fully perform legibility because the person you were with could already read the unsaid, of not having to translate the interior into something socially presentable because the person receiving it had enough attunement to receive it more directly. The avoidant, whose interior life is rich and defended and rarely fully accessible to anyone, found in your presence a degree of genuine ease that their ordinary relational experience does not provide. not always consciously. Not always with the awareness of how specifically your attunement was producing the ease, but the nervous system knew, and its knowledge is now visible in the specific, persistent absence of that ease in the days without your presence. The third component is the stabilizing quality of your consistency. The avoidance interior experience is, despite the composed exterior, not consistently stable. The fear runs. The attachment system activates and manages and activates again. The defended architecture requires ongoing maintenance, and your consistency, the specific, reliable, always available quality of your engagement, was functioning as a stabilizing influence on this interior experience in ways the avoidant was not consciously registering. Your predictable presence was reducing the background anxiety of the attachment system scanning. Your consistent engagement was providing, without announcement, a degree of relational security that the avoidant's ordinary level of self-sufficiency was not producing on its own. And the absence of it, the return to the unsupported state, the reactivation of the scanning without the consistent engagement that was quietly regulating it, is one of the most specifically felt components of your absence, in the specific quality of a background anxiety that has increased without an obvious cause, in the restlessness, in the reaching of attention towards something and finding nothing. The fifth stage of what your absence produces in the avoidant is the one that is most relevant to understanding what is happening on their side of the dynamic right now. The stage that follows the regret and the retroactive accounting and the specific felt experience of the components of your value, the stage that determines what all of it becomes. It is the stage of the choice, not a single, declared, I have decided to change moment. The ongoing, daily, repeated internal choice about what to do with everything the absence has exposed. Whether to allow the exposure to do its full work, to sit in the regret, to allow the retroactive accounting to reach its honest conclusions, to let the felt experience of the components of your value produce the genuine reckoning that the exposure was always pointing toward. Or whether to manage the exposure back to a tolerable level. To allow the initial intensity of the recognition to fade through the ordinary passage of time and the ordinary operation of the management strategies, to a level that is no longer producing the discomfort of full honest confrontation. To file the experience of your absence as something that happened and was difficult and is now, with the appropriate passage of time, becoming manageable, without the reckoning, without the fundamental change. This is the fork in the road that every significant loss presents to the avoidant. And the direction they take, the choice they make, consciously or not, deliberately or through the accumulation of small daily choices about whether to stay with the discomfort or find the exit, is the most important thing the absence produces. More important than the recognition of your value. More important than the regret. More important than the specific, genuine, finally felt understanding of what was taken for granted. Those things are the arrival at the fork. What they do at the fork is what determines whether anything genuine comes from the whole experience. What genuine reckoning looks like, the version of the choice that allows the absence to do its full and transformative work, is worth describing in some detail because it is the version that produces something actually different, rather than the temporary disruption of the equilibrium that eventually restores without the fundamental shift. Genuine reckoning looks like the avoidant staying with the discomfort of the retroactive accounting long enough for it to reach the level of behavioral implication, not just the intellectual recognition of the pattern or the felt experience of the regret. The specific pointed, this is what I will do differently level of accounting. The identification not just of what the dynamic was producing in you, but of what their specific choices were contributing to that production. The naming, at the instance level, of the moments when the alternative was available and the withdrawal was chosen instead. And the commitment, not the declared commitment, the behavioral, over time, in ordinary circumstances visible commitment, to choosing differently when the equivalent moment arrives next. It looks like reaching toward you when the reaching occurs in a way that carries the specific quality of someone who has done enough internal work that the reaching is not simply the urgency of activated loss seeking relief. That has a different weight. A more honest weight. The weight of someone who knows more specifically than they did before about what they were not giving and is attempting to give something closer to what the situation actually requires. Not perfectly. The imperfection is expected and acceptable. But genuinely. It looks like being willing to hold the conversation about what happened rather than routing around it. The avoidant who has genuinely reckoned can engage with the honest accounting of the dynamic without immediately converting the conversation into a mutual difficulty narrative or a defensive reconstruction or a warmth-forward reconnection that bypasses the necessary examination of what the warmth was previously insufficient to sustain. They can stay in the honest conversation, not without discomfort. With it, choosing to stay with the discomfort because they have had the experience of what the alternative costs, and the experience has been sufficiently real and sufficiently consequential that the choosing differently is genuinely motivated rather than performed. What your absence has exposed about your value is, in the honest accounting, something you always deserve to have acknowledged: the quality of your attention, the specific stabilizing effect of your consistency, the ease your attunement created. The love offered generously and consistently and without the conditional quality that would have made it less than what it was. All of it was real. All of it was valuable. All of it was contributing to the quality of the dynamic and of the avoidance interior experience in ways that were never adequately recognized while the recognition was available. The avoidance belated recognition of it is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of the specific limitation of a psychology that has been practiced at taking available things for granted and discovering the significance of things through the experience of their absence. The limitation is theirs. The value was always yours. And the value is not changed by having gone unrecognized, was not diminished by the taking for granted, was not somehow less real because the avoidance defended architecture prevented the recognition from being available while the value was present and accessible and daily contributing to something real. The value was always there. In the specific quality of everything you brought, in the consistency, in the attention, in the generosity of spirit that kept the offering available long past the point where adequate reciprocation would have been reasonable to require, in the love that was real and full and given without the managed, rationed quality of someone protecting themselves from the cost of loving. You brought all of that. You brought it every day in the ordinary, unannounced, entirely unperformed way of someone who loves genuinely and shows up consistently and does not require the acknowledgement of the showing up in order to continue showing up. That is not a small thing. That is not a common thing. That is the specific, rare, genuinely extraordinary quality of someone whose capacity for love is large enough to sustain itself without the constant validation of recognition. Who loves because the loving is true, rather than because the loving is being adequately received? The exposure of your value by your absence is the avoidance late arrival at an accurate assessment of something that was true the entire time. Their arrival is not the creation of your value. It is the discovery of what was always there. And you, standing in your absence, living your life, building the ground that the dynamic was always preventing you from fully building. You do not need the avoidance recognition to know your value. You have access to it directly, through the honest assessment of what you brought and what you gave, and what the quality of your love and your presence actually consisted of. Through the specific, clear, entirely self-available knowledge of what it is to show up consistently for someone who is not yet capable of consistently meeting the showing up. The absence exposed your value to them, but the value was always visible to you if you were willing to look at it honestly, rather than through the diminishing lens of a dynamic that kept requiring you to question whether what you were offering was adequate. It was adequate. It was more than adequate. It was extraordinary in the specific, quiet, undramatic way of something that arrives every day, without announcement, and gives without calculation, and loves without the armor that would have made the loving safer and less. That is your value. Not the version the avoidant is discovering through the experience of your absence. The version that was always true, that was always there. That the dynamic was never properly honoring, and that you deserve, going forward, to offer only to someone whose architecture includes the capacity to recognize it while it is present, not after it is gone, while it is there, daily, on the ordinary Tuesday, without the absence being required to make the presence valuable. That is what you deserve. Not the belated recognition of loss, the daily, present, genuinely chosen acknowledgement of what you are and what you bring, from someone who can see it while it is there, who does not require its removal to understand its worth. That person exists. That relationship is possible. The version of love that meets you in the quality of your offering, rather than discovering the quality of your offering only in its absence. That is where you are going. That is what the absence was always building toward. Not the avoidance recognition, though that recognition is real and significant, and a form of justice, but your own clear, unhurried, entirely self-possessed knowledge of what you are worth. And the absolute, unshakable, forward-facing commitment to accepting nothing less than the love that can see that worthwhile you are present to offer it. Not when you are gone. Now, here, in the full and living presence of everything you are. The full and living presence of everything you are is not something you step into cleanly after a dynamic like this. 1. It is not a switch that flips. It is not the immediate, uncomplicated inhabiting of a self that was always whole and simply needed the dynamic to end in order to be accessible again. The self that exists in the aftermath of having been genuinely undervalued, of having contributed something real and consistent and extraordinary, and watched it be taken for granted, for the length of a dynamic that should have known better. That self has work to do. Not the dramatic, urgent, crisis-level work of someone who has been catastrophically broken. The quieter, more specific, more personally targeted work of someone who has been subtly and persistently shaped by an environment that did not adequately reflect their worth. And that shaping, quiet as it was, deposited specific things in specific places that require specific attention to identify and address. The first thing it deposited is the habit of pre-qualification, the specific, automatic, below-conscious tendency to qualify your own value before expressing it, to soften the statement of your need before it has even been made, to preemptively reduce the size of your ask to something that feels safer, more likely to be received without the discomfort of its full honest weight. This habit was built in the dynamic because the dynamic consistently rewarded the qualified version and produced the withdrawal in response to the full version. The avoidance management of closeness through distance taught you, through repetition, that the full expression of your need or your worth or your desire for adequate reciprocation was too much for the relational environment to hold. And so you learned to bring a reduced version, to fit your expression to the available container rather than requiring the container to expand to your size. This habit travels. It does not stay in the relationship where it was built. It moves with you into subsequent interactions, subsequent relationships, subsequent encounters with people who are actually capable of receiving the full version and who are never given the opportunity to demonstrate that capacity because the pre-qualification has already reduced what is offered. The person who could have met your full need is presented with the pre-qualified version and meets that, and you never discover whether the full version was available to be met because you never offered it to find out. Recognizing this habit, seeing it clearly, naming it specifically, catching it in the act of operating, is one of the most important pieces of work available in the aftermath of the dynamic. Not with the harsh quality of self-criticism, with the patient, clear-eyed quality of someone who understands exactly how the habit was built and why it made sense in the environment that built it, and why it no longer makes sense in the environment you are building toward. The pre-qualification was adaptive. It is no longer necessary. And its no longer necessity can only become visible if you are willing to look at it honestly rather than continuing to operate within it without awareness. The second thing the dynamic deposited is a distorted baseline for what reciprocation looks like, a recalibrated sense of what is normal in the specific experience of being valued and responded to by someone you're in relationship with. Because the avoidance pattern of taking for granted while genuinely feeling, of receiving the consistent contribution of your presence, without consistently acknowledging or matching it, is not the neutral, obvious, clearly wrong to everyone experience it sounds like in description. In lived experience, it normalizes. The taking for granted becomes what relationships feel like. The insufficiency of the reciprocation becomes the expected baseline. And the specific, available, non-dramatic form of adequate reciprocation, the ordinary showing up, the consistent acknowledgement, the daily evidence of being valued while present rather than after absent, begins to feel, through the erosion of the distorted baseline, like something more than you are entitled to expect. This is one of the most consequential effects of the dynamic on your forward relational life. Because if the baseline for what reciprocation looks like has been distorted downward, if the specific experience of consistent undervaluing has taught you that adequate reciprocation is exceptional rather than ordinary, you are at genuine risk of encountering adequate reciprocation in future relationships, and either not recognizing it as such, or more painfully, experiencing it as excessive and therefore uncomfortable, as too much, as a level of care that feels disproportionate because the proportions themselves have been recalibrated by the dynamic. The restoration of the accurate baseline is not automatic. It requires the specific, deliberate, ongoing work of checking your assessments of reciprocation against an honest standard, rather than against the distorted standard the dynamic established. Of asking, when someone shows up for you consistently, whether the consistency is genuinely notable or whether it is the ordinary baseline of what adequate care in a functional relationship looks like. Of allowing the latter to be possible without immediately coding it as extraordinary, because if adequate care is experienced as extraordinary, it will be treated as fragile, and the treating of it as fragile will make it harder to build on. The accurate baseline is not demanding. It is simply honest. Consistent showing up is ordinary in a functional relationship. Daily evidence of being valued is ordinary. The acknowledgement of your contribution while you are present, not requiring your absence to expose it, is ordinary. None of these things are too much to expect. All of them are the floor rather than the ceiling. And the dynamic, in distorting your sense of where the floor is, may have left you with a floor that is lower than it should be, and a ceiling that is lower than you deserve. Restoring the accurate positions of both is part of the work. The third deposit is perhaps the most personally significant because it is the most interior and the least visible from outside. It is the specific way that the dynamic affected your relationship with your own perception. You perceived the avoidant accurately. Not always immediately, not always without the distortion of hope and love, and the specific human desire to see the best in someone you care about. But over time, with the accumulation of evidence, your perception of the dynamic was accurate. You knew when the warmth was real and when it was managed. You knew when the return after withdrawal was genuine repair and when it was comfortable restoration. You knew, in the specific embodied pre-verbal way of someone who is paying attention, when something was not right. When the dynamic was asking more than it was giving. When the reciprocation was insufficient. When the pattern was producing a cost that was not being adequately acknowledged. And the dynamic, in its operation, consistently encouraged you to doubt that perception. Not through explicit challenge, not usually through the avoidant directly telling you that your perception was wrong, though that sometimes occurred. Through the subtler mechanism of the perception being met with insufficient evidence of its accuracy, through the warmth that arrived after the withdrawal, which temporarily contradicted the perception, through the genuine moments of connection that complicated the simpler story of consistent undervaluing, through the specific avoidant characteristic management of your expressions of concern or need, or honest assessment in ways that kept the perception from ever arriving at the clean, confirmed, fully substantiated conclusion that would have given it enough authority to act on. The result is a specific, targeted erosion of confidence in your own perception, the habit of second-guessing the accurate read, of adding qualifications to the honest assessment, of asking whether you are being too sensitive, too demanding, too focused on the insufficiencies rather than the genuine moments. The habit of interpreting your own clear perception through the lens of the dynamic's interest in not being clearly perceived. This erosion is one of the most important things to address in the aftermath, because your perception is a resource, a specific, valuable, actually accurate resource that was working correctly throughout the dynamic and was systematically made to feel less reliable than it was. Restoring confidence in it is not the work of convincing yourself you are always right. You are not always right. Everyone's perception has limits and biases and the specific distortions that loving someone introduces. Restoring confidence in your perception is the work of distinguishing between the honest self-questioning that keeps perception accurate and the externally induced doubt that was serving the dynamic's interest in not being accurately perceived. The distinction is this: honest self-questioning produces better accuracy over time. Externally induced doubt produces paralysis. If the questioning of your perception is making you more accurate and more genuinely discerning, it is honest self-questioning. If it is making you less able to trust any of your readings, less able to act on what you clearly see, it is the residue of the dynamic's specific interest in keeping your perception uncertain. Trust the accurate readings, the ones that were right and were doubted. They were right. The doubt was not honest self-questioning. It was the dynamic protecting itself from the consequences of being clearly seen. Your absence exposed your value to the avoidant. And in exposing your value to them, it also, through the specific process of living outside the dynamic, of inhabiting a life that is not organized around their patterns, of encountering yourself in the absence of the dynamic's shaping, exposed your value to you in a different way. In the specific, quiet, gradually accumulating way of someone who is rediscovering what their days feel like when the chronic anxiety is not present. When the loneliness while together is not the texture of the evenings. when the pre-qualification is not the operating mode of the interaction, when the perception is not being managed against its own accuracy. The rediscovery is not always comfortable. Some of what you rediscover is the size of what the dynamic was costing. The specific, substantial, when you see it clearly size of it. The amount of bandwidth and attention and emotional resource that was allocated to the management of the dynamic, rather than to the living of your actual life. The version of yourself that was available before the dynamic's gravity pulled so much of your attention outward toward the monitoring of someone else's patterns, the preferences that were set aside, the voice that was quieted, the specific, personal, entirely legitimate ways of being in the world that were adjusted to fit the dynamic's available space. Seeing the size of the cost is not pleasant, but it is clarifying. It converts what was happening in the dynamic from something ambient and normalized into something specific and visible, and specific visible things can be addressed in ways that ambient normalized things cannot. The pre-qualification can be unlearned if it is seen. The distorted baseline can be restored if it is named. The eroded perceptual confidence can be rebuilt if the erosion is recognized as external rather than inherent. The avoidant is sitting with the exposure of your value from their side of the absence. You are sitting with it from yours, and what the exposure produces on each side is different. On their side, it produces the recognition, late, genuine, consequential, of what your presence was worth. On your side, it produces something more fundamental, the return to yourself. To the version of yourself that your value actually belongs to, rather than the version that was shaped by a dynamic that consistently under-acknowledged it. Your value was always yours, not the dynamics, not the avoidance recognition to bestow or withhold, always yours, in the specific, quiet, daily way of someone who contributes something real to every environment they inhabit, who brings something genuine to every relationship they invest in. Who loves with a quality and a consistency that is not common and is not small and is not adequately described by any accounting that the dynamic was able to produce. The absence made this visible to the avoidant. Good. That visibility is accurate, and it is deserved, and it is a form of justice, however belated, that the value you were always bringing is finally being felt in the specific, undeniable way of its absence, rather than the overlooked way of its presence. But the visibility to the avoidant is a side effect. Not the point. The point, the one your absence has been building toward, the one this entire conversation has been circling, is the visibility to you. The return to the honest, full, clear-eyed knowledge of what you are and what you bring, and what the specific quality of your love and your presence, and your consistently offered, never accurately recognized contribution actually consists of. You know it now. Not because the avoidance recognition confirmed it, because the living of a life outside the dynamic has been demonstrating it. In the specific ways your presence affects the other spaces and relationships and interactions you inhabit. In the ease that your attention creates for the people who receive it, without the defended architecture that prevented the avoidant from fully receiving it. In the specific, quiet, daily evidence of someone whose value is visible to the people who are capable of seeing it while it is present, rather than only in its absence. That evidence is accumulating, quietly, in the ordinary days outside the dynamic, in the interactions that are not characterized by the specific grinding daily cost of loving someone whose patterns keep preventing the love from landing properly, in the mornings that begin with your own thoughts, in the decisions made from genuine preference, in the slowly, incrementally, genuinely improving quality of a life that is being lived, rather than managed. The avoidance recognition of your value, while real, is not the destination. It is a data point, a confirmation of something that was always true. The destination is the life that is being built on that truth. The relationships that will honor it while it is present. The version of love that does not require your departure to know your worth. You're already on the way to that destination. Have been since the absence began, moving toward it in the quiet, undramatic, daily way that real destinations are actually reached. Not in a single moment of revelation, in the accumulation of ordinary days that belong to you, building something that the dynamic could not contain, the full, undiminished, entirely present version of the life your value has always deserved to inhabit. It is being built. You are building it. And what it becomes will be worth everything the absence cost you to find it.